Well, welcome to a lecture on behavior that is not learned. There's no chapter in the textbook that covers this information, but after studying a little bit about the history, chapter 1, and before we launch into associative learning, or just basically behavior that is learned, it seems appropriate to think about behavior that is not learned. And we often talk about instinctive behavior, we talk about innate behavior, we talk about inborn behavior, genetically based behavior. And all of these refer to behavior that is not learned. So I want to start off, first of all, when we talk about behavior that's not learned, really the only behavior that we know of that is not learned is basic reflexes. Now, we're going to see that basic reflexes don't always stay real basic. They can get pretty complicated. Also, this notion of genetic-based behaviors, we really don't have any good evidence of that as yet. It may show up in the future, and genetically determined things like schizophrenia, alcoholism, the genetic component is very, very small in these studies. It's interesting they find any genetic influence at all on our behavior, but the data just doesn't seem to support what most people think it does. That is, we don't have instincts. There is no innate behaviors. We have reflexes. Now, we'll talk somewhat about endogenous factors in this class. That is, these behaviors that come from within. And again, that's a genetic basis, but it's things like simple things like metabolic changes that increase fat stores. So these are not what we ordinarily would think of as innate behaviors or instincts. In fact, several years, it's been over a decade now, in which psychologists have pretty much done away with the whole concept of instinct. Biologists, of course, did away with instincts very early on. So we do, however, have genetically based behaviors as a result of evolution, and these things are reflexes. So let's jump into it and take a look at behavior that is not learned. We've got 4 basic topics here. The simple reflex arc. We'll talk then about 4 different types of reflexive behaviors. And we'll talk about how reflexive behaviors can be temporarily modified. And finally, we'll talk about a major theory, opponent process theory, that concerns reflexive behavior. Well, the simple reflex arc has been around since Aristotle. Descartes in the 1600s was noted for his work in basic reflexes, and we've already considered René Descartes' work when we looked at the history of everything. Notice in the simple 3-neuron reflex arc, and this is about the simplest, there is a 2-neuron reflex arc, but let's talk about this 3-neuron reflex arc. It's the most common for our reflexes. So you can see we have an external stimulus. In all cases, a reflex involves an external stimulus that elicits or evokes a muscular response or a hormonal response, for that matter, in the subject. So we get an external stimulus to start off. It is picked up by a sensory neuron. That is, you must have a sensory system, receptor sites in neurons in order to detect external stimuli. So a sensory neuron is activated by the physical, real-world stimulus. It sends a signal into the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, there's a small neuron called the interneuron that bridges the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Now, so the signal proceeds from the stimulus down the sensory neuron to the spinal column, where it synapses with the interneuron, which synapses with the motor neuron, and the motor neuron then is connected to the muscle or the hormonal endocrine system that elicits the response. Okay, contracts a muscle, for example. This slide is supposed to show you the basic action that was just talked about. It may or may not be working. Getting these slides to work in D2L is always, and on different computers, is always a difficult thing. But our basic 3-neuron reflex is when you feel the flame of a candle, or a hot stove for that matter, and it activates the sensory neuron you see here in yellow, to the interneuron you see in green, and then the motor neuron, which you see in blue, and the motor neuron activates the bicep, and boom, you pull your arm off the flame. as you well know, this happens very, very quickly.
In a reflex arc, sensory information is processed at the level of the spinal cord, resulting in action without involvement of the brain. For example, if one's fingers are burned by a candle, the hand that receives the painful stimulus is rapidly removed from the flame with a jerking motion. At the same time, the brain is receiving information indicating that a painful event occurred in the hand. It is important to understand that although the brain may perceive the painful stimulus, the reflex arc acts to retract the hand without direct input from the brain.
I did want to mention, before I get into these 4 types of reflexive behavior, that there is a 2-neuron reflex arc. Now, the only one that we know about, in the human at least, involves the knee-jerk reflex. So when you bend your knee slightly, relax it, and hit the right under the kneecap with a small, just a light blow. It doesn't have to be hard, a little rubber mallet or something, or the edge of your hand even, a little karate chop to your knee, and you get a knee-jerk response. As it turns out, that one has no inner neuron. It's one long neuron that basically well, 2 neurons, the sensory neuron detecting the hit on the knee, and then the muscle neuron. It still travels all the way up the back of your leg to the spinal column, and then down the back, and then the motor neuron travels back down to the muscle involved in the reflex. However, the 3-neuron reflex arc is the most common. Notice one more thing about these reflex arcs. There's no way for your brain to control them. That is, there are neurons that go to the brain. These are feedback neurons. And what they do is they basically tell your brain, hey, your knee just jerked. A hammer hit it and your knee jerked. Sometimes we call these kinesthetic feedback neurons. They let us know what's going on with our bodies. However, there's no controlling neurons. There's no neurons going from the brain out to the muscles involved in these reflexes. So we cannot control our reflexes, and that's what makes them reflexes. Reflexes are defined as survival mechanisms. Evolution has provided us with certain behaviors that must be present at birth in order to survive. The infant suckling reflex, for example, the digestive reflex, our pupils dilating as a result of change in illumination. Again, basic survival mechanisms is how we define our reflexes. Well, with that out of the way, let's talk about the 4 types of reflexes. You see here we have kinesis, taxis, modal action patterns, and interacting reflexes. Well, kinesis refers to random movement in response to a stimulus, and the place where one of the classic examples are these wood lice, as you see here, the little roly-poly bugs. And if they are in too dry of an environment, they tend to pop around like popcorn. It's not totally random. As you can see here, the little chart showing you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the motions that they take as they hop around. Basically, this is undirected motion. It's just random movement. The idea is that by popping around like little kernels of popcorn, they'll eventually wind up in a place that's wet enough for them, and that will then stop. So too dry is the stimulus that activates this reflexive movement. Taxis is a directed movement. Moth to a flame is a classic example of a taxis. We call that one phototaxic. That is photo meaning light, so we get a phototaxis, drawn to the light, drawn to the flame. Directed movement then is a taxis. You can see here in the table there's a number of different taxis: trophotaxis, phyllotaxis, phototaxis, chemotaxis, geotaxis, rheotaxis, goes on and on. Modal action pattern. Some people still call these fixed action pattern, but that's kind of an old school name. We now realize that it's more modal, meaning it happens in most species most of the time, but not necessarily in every single one of them every single time, as a fixed action pattern would suggest. So modal action pattern, then, you can, if you were trained in previous school with fixed action patterns, that's fine. They're really one and the same thing. The digger wasp is the classic example here. Now, modal action patterns involve a series of behaviors. So there's a stimulus that starts off with one behavior, then a second behavior, then a third behavior. Okay? And there could be 4 or 5 behaviors in the sequence. Now, the thing is, the stimulus that activates the sequence of responses, right, if it gets interrupted anywhere along the line and the animal can't complete the responses in proper sequence, then it has to start over from the beginning. That is, the stimulus has to be reintroduced in order to start over the responses from the beginning. So they do have to run off in order, same order every single time. As you can see here, the digger wasp, the classic example, is the female digs a burrow to lay her eggs in, and she then puts a cricket into each one of the burrows, and she has an odd habit of inspecting the burrow after finding a cricket before she goes into it, and if everything's cool in there, then she drags the cricket in and lays her eggs on it. She then gets another cricket and repeats this behavior. Now, when she comes back to the nest, if she sets her cricket down and somebody picks that cricket up and puts it away, right, she has to go get it and just move it an inch or 2 away, right? And she has to go get it and put it back where it was and then re-inspect. That's what we mean by the behavior has to run off in the same order every time. Here's another modal action pattern. There are 2 different types of lovebirds, and you can see these lovebirds in any pet store. And what they do, as you can see here, is they strip pieces of paper to make nests. Now, Fisher's lovebird, as you can see, strips off paper and holds it in its beak and flies to the nest where it puts the paper in the nest and starts weaving it in to make a nest. Whereas the peach-faced lovebirds, they actually tuck it into areas in their tail feathers. And so when they fly, they don't carry it in their beak, they have it tucked under their feathers. 2 very different modal action patterns.